Chapter 9 of the Book of This and That, Stupidity. Surely honest men may thank God they belonged to the stupid party. The Spectator, March 28, 1914. It is a terrible thing to boast of stupidity, even in irony. It is a still more terrible thing to associate stupidity with honesty. There is a good deal to be said in favor of honesty, but stupidity in the garb of honesty is the merest masquerader. There was once a member of a local body whom I heard praised in the words, "He's the only honest man in the corporation, and that is because he is too stupid to be anything else." I doubt if predestined honesty of this sort is entitled to a statue. It has its public uses, no doubt, as an occasional stumbling block to those who traffic both in their own and other people's virtue. Here, at least, is virtue that cannot be bought at a crisis. On the other hand, it does not withstand the temptations of gold a bit more sturdily than it withstands the appeals of reason. It will not move either for £1,000 or for the Archangel Gabriel. It bars the way to heaven and the road to hell impartially. It has the unbudgeableness of the ass rather than the adaptability which enables human beings to survive on this wrinkled planet. Even so, one may admit a sneaking respect and affection for honest, stupid people in private life. It is when they feel called upon to devote their combined honesty and stupidity to public affairs that one begins to tremble and to wonder whether, after all, an honest fool or a clever rogue is likely to do better service to the state. Oscar Wilde once said it was well that good people did not live to see the evil results of their goodness, and that wicked people did not live to see the good results of their wickedness. This is true, perhaps, no matter how cunning one may be in one's virtue, or how provident in one's vices. But it is especially true of that blind and bigoted honesty which cannot see further than its nose. I know a town where the lamplighter 20 years ago was an honest old man of the blind and bigoted type. It was his duty to go out and light the lamps of the little town on every night when there was no moon. One month, however, it was noticed that all the lamps were alight while the moon was blazing, and that when the moon was dark, the lamps were dark too. The old man was called before the town committee to account for his disobedience to orders. Instead of apologizing, however, he firmly insisted that he had done his duty, and produced a calendar to prove that there was no moon on the nights on which everybody had seen it shining, and that it might have reasonably been expected to shine on the nights on which it was obscured. He was asked why he did not trust his eyes, but he said that he always went by the calendar, and he would not yield an inch of his position till someone took the calendar from him and noticed that it was not even a current one, but a calendar of the previous year. There, I think, is a dramatization of a very common form of honesty. It is as common among cabinet ministers and churchmen as among aged lamplighters. It expresses itself in adherence not only to antiquated Mother Segal calendars, but to constitutions and confessions of faith that have lost their meaning. Whether this can justly be called honesty at all is a question with something to be said on both sides. It is certainly stupidity of the very best quality. One of the reasons why one rather disbelieves in reverencing stupidity is that it is not always as honest as it looks. It is often an armor, instinctively, if not deliberately, put on by comfortable people. This kind of stupidity has sometimes been attributed to excessive eating and drinking, as when Holinshed wrote of the 16th century Scots that they far exceed us in overmuch and distemperate gourmandise, and so engross their bodies that divers of them do oft become unapt to any other purpose than to spend their times in large tabling and belly cheer. But I have known gluttons who have yet had all their wits about them, and ladies who could hardly get through the wing of a chicken, and were nevertheless as stupid as a prize cat, blinking beside the fire. There is more in it than the stomach. Stupidity of the kind I mean is really an ingeniously built castle, with moat and drawbridge to guard against the entrance of the facts of life, at least of the disagreeable facts of life. It is by a perfect network of castles of this kind that so many feudal privileges have been kept alive, generations after anyone defends the idea of feudalism. Against stupidity, it has been said, the gods themselves fight in vain, and it is hardly to be wondered at that democracy also falls back from the impassive walls of those old castles like a broken tide. It is only fair to say, however, that again and again different noble inmates, how suggestive a word, of the castles have refused to shelter themselves behind the drawbridge of stupidity, and have even offered to lead the people in an assault on castles in general. It is then usually discovered that the people, too, have their dear retreat of stupidity, to which they fly on the first hint of a raid upon Utopia. The stupidity of the underfed is an even more desperate thing than the stupidity of the overfed, and when a castellan offers his sword to the cause, they merely look at each other and ask darkly, "What's he going to get out of it?" It is the popular stupidity which led Mr. Shaw the other day to observe that he had more hope of converting a millionaire than a millionaire's chauffeur to socialism. Certainly it is the stupid in the back streets who make the stupid in the castles secure. The latter see in the former, indeed, not only their first line of defense, but their justification. They see their justification, however, in everything and everybody. They wrap themselves up in little comforting thoughts that the poor do not feel things as the respectable do. I have heard a comfortable artist, for instance, in winter, arguing that there was no need to pity a blind beggar shivering at a street corner. "Each of us is kept warm," he declared, "by a little stove in his stomach, and you would be surprised to know how little it takes to keep a man like that's stove alight. You see, he's been training himself all his life to do with very little food and very little clothing, and to sit out in all kinds of weather. A fall in the temperature that would paralyze you or me would affect him hardly more than a fall in the price of champagne. You see, he's learned to do without things." There was almost a note of envy in his voice, for the man who had learned to do without things, without soap and meat and blankets and clothes, brushes and servants and fires and sunshine. That seems to be one of the favorite hypocrisies of the stupid, the pretense of envying the poor. I have seen a merchant grow suddenly eloquent as he described the happy lot of the working man, who had nothing to do but draw his wages, and compared it with the anxious life of the employer, who had all the cares and responsibilities of the business on his shoulders. The rich never feel so good as when they are speaking of their possessions as responsibilities. Here a mistress set forth the advantages of the life of a servant girl, how she not only gets higher wages than servants ever got before, but think of the food and the rent to pay. She even becomes mawkish over the fortune of a girl who was too poor to be called upon to pay rates and taxes. Alas, These ideals of the kitchen are all written in the drawing room. If a servant's life were all a matter of freedom from rent and rates and taxes and the worries of making both ends meet on 1,000 a year, the idols would be apt enough. But it is just possible that even to make both ends meet on £25 a year may have its own difficulties. Certainly one has a right to suspect these ladies who glorify the life of a cook and the parlor maid. I will refuse to believe in them till I hear that one of them has run away from her husband to take one of those sinecures advertised in the domestic service columns of the Morning Post. But perhaps their sense of duty is too strong to allow them to fly from their responsibilities in that way. Stupidity might be defined as resignation to other people's misfortunes. Alternatively, is it a way of regarding comforts as responsibilities and of getting out of one's uncomfortable responsibilities altogether? There is no greater enemy of change, for, granted enough stupidity, it is easy to believe that hell itself is heaven. It is the stupidity of the rich, rather than deliberate heartlessness, that permits so many of them to live cheerfully on ill-paid labor and slum rents. Fortunately, the cheerful dullness of rich people is rarer than it was a century ago. Then it was reinforced by political economy, which regarded transactions in human beings in much the same light as transactions in pounds of tea. Our first awakening to the right of other people to live happened just before we gave up cannibalism. The second happened just before we gave up slavery. The third will happen just before we give up capitalism. Obviously, it is only our stupidity which enables us to go on putting the rights of Tom, Dick, and Harry before the rights of the race. It is only our stupidity which makes us believe that while it is right that superfluous wealth should be taxed a shilling in the pound for the good of all, it would be robbery to tax it 10 shillings in the pound for the good of all. The first statesman who levied the first tax thereby announced the dual ownership of property between the citizen and the state. He vindicated the right of the state, representing the common good, as against the individual, representing only his private good, to a first share in property. The income tax stands for exactly the same principle in regard to state rights as would the nationalization of the land or the railways. As we grow less stupid, we shall gradually awake to the fact that there is no right to food and shelter and state benevolence that we possess which our neighbors ought not also in justice to possess. We shall gradually understand, for instance, that it is not worth while that 1,000 children should be brought up in the gutters of misery in order that a few dozen young gentlemen may sup on plovers' eggs. It has already dawned upon us that if pensions are good for field marshals, they cannot be so very bad for linen lappers. Perhaps we shall yet come to see that a pension is a very good thing to begin life with as well as to end life with. In the meantime, most of us are either too comfortable or too miserable to think about such things. Our stupidity, at least, keeps conscience or revolution from destroying the peace of our meals. End of section 9. Chapter 10. Waste. When Mr. Churchill referred in Manchester to the piling up of armaments as so much misdirected human energy, he said something which men of all parties will agree, except those few romantic souls who believe that it is a bracing thing to shed the blood of a foreigner every now and then. Obviously, if two men live beside one another, and if each of them is so afraid of the other's climbing secretly into his back garden that he hires a watchman, To walk up and down the garden path all day and night with a six-shooter in his hand, he is wasting on his fears a great deal of energy that might be expended on cabbages. Again, if there is a stream running between the gardens, and if each of the householders is always preparing for the day when the other may question his right to use the water, he will have to hire other strong men, and many a man who might have made a good blacksmith or barman may be turned into a sailor. The situation is so absurd that it does not bear thinking about, except as a game. The military aristocracies who treat preparation for war as a form of sport are in this entirely logical. On the other hand, when the burgess fulminates against war as though it were the only example of wasted human energy that does not bear thinking of, he is shutting his eyes to the fact that the whole of modern civilization is built upon a foundation of waste, where it is not built upon a foundation of want. Our estimates of men and nations rise and fall with their capacity for waste. The great nation, in the eyes of the imperialist, is the nation that can waste the world. It is the nation that can mow down harvests of savages without even the comparatively decent excuse that it wants to eat them. It is the nation that can make the genius of other nations as though it were not, that can ruin harbors and send ships worth £1,000,000 to the bottom of the sea. I do not say that there are not other elements that have a part in the greatness of nations, but the power of destruction alone is enough to make any nation supreme for a day, and the supremacy of no nation lasts much longer and remembered in history. Similarly with individual men and women. Everybody, said Emerson, loves a lover. It would be almost truer to say that everybody loves a wastrel. In our boyhood, we love those who waste themselves. In our discreeter years, we envy those who can waste the lives of others. It has often been noticed that youths and maidens have a tenderness for drunkards and rakes. They reverence the genius of life wasted, almost more than the genius of life fulfilled. Byron, whose vices killed him in his 30s, Sidney Carton, who was seldom sober, Mr. Kipling's gentleman rankers, damned from here to eternity, these awake a passionate devotion in the breasts of the young, such as is never lavished on successful grocers. It is the prodigal son, and not his respectable brother, at whom affectionate eyes look round as he passes along the street. Perhaps it is because he is so much more obviously trying a fall with destiny than the grocer. The mark of doom makes a more picturesque effect on the brow than a silk-lined bowler hat. According to this view, the wastrel owes his appeal largely to the fact that he is a fighter in a lost cause, the cause of those who have lifted hands against the universe. The reverence of middle age for the wealthier geniuses of waste, however, cannot be explained on grounds like these. One does not think of Lord Tomnoddy or Sir Alexander Soapsuds as a warrior against destiny. The prodigality of the rich appeals to us for quite other reasons than does the prodigality of the prodigal. We endure it chiefly because we envy it. The dream of being a rich man who can thrust out men and women from their homes to make room for pheasants, who by sheer economic pressure can force us to make bonbons for his guests, when we ought to be making boots for ourselves, who can take a man who might be a duke and turn him into a flunky, lulls us into a kind of satisfaction with the world. The man who has the power to waste fields and men and women and money and labor is the king who rules in every vulgar heart among us. His royal wastefulness in food and servants and ornaments brings him, it may be granted, not a teaspoonful of added health or an egg cupful more of happiness. Even the poets who have so often sung for rich masters have always had the grace to warn them that overeating and overdrinking and overconfidence in this world's goods was merely 3 death's heads dressed up in seductive bonnets. But the truth is we never believe the poets when once we have laid down the book. Our ideal of wastefulness is firmly rooted in us beyond the attacks of any aesthete with his harmless little quiver of phrases. Even when we are not rich ourselves, we can imitate the rich in their wastefulness. There is nothing the average servant scorns more than the house in which she is expected to make use of the torsos of loaves, and in which she is forbidden to sacrifice odds and ends of meat to the little gods of the dustbin. She loves the house where there is milk for the sink, as well as for the children and the cat. Years ago, when some people were advocating a tax on salt, they did so on the ground that no one need suffer, since at present everybody puts on his plate several times as much salt as he ever uses. Hence, if we were more careful with the salt, such a tax would be a tax not on salt, but on wastefulness. It is the same with mustard. I remember a Scotsman once asking me in a hushed voice if I knew how Coleman had made his fortune. I thought from my friend's solemn air that it must have been in some sensational way, by buying a deserted gold mine or running a South American revolution, but my friend merely pointed to the plate from which I was eating. He made it, he declared solemnly, out of mustard you leave on the edge of your plate. Perhaps the Scotsman was right in shaking his head so gravely over our extravagance in mustard, but somehow I too have the kitchen's taste for superfluities, and enough never seems half so good as a little more. Horace described the happy man as the man who had enough and something over for servants and thieves. Oh, the little more, and how much it is! Even if we grudge it to the thieves, we love it because of the sense it gives us that we are no longer struggling in the water, but sitting in triumph over the dry land. The average Englishman dislikes tariff reform, not entirely because he has grasped the economics of the subject, but because it would bring him in a system which would compel him to be as thrifty as a Frenchman and as careful as a German. One must admit to a certain degree of sympathy with him. When one hears of French peasants, as once I did, calling round after the meals of the rich to carry off the scrapings of the plates to make soup for their families, and of their doing this not because they were very poor, because they were very thrifty, one's heart suddenly rejoices at the sight of the tattered old flag of prodigality again. One does not want to see thrift given the extreme character of an orgy. On the other hand, a good many of us get an easy sense of the heroic by living in lordly wastefulness. It appeals to us as a kind of enlargement of our personality. That is why so many of us shrink with horror from such social economies as a kitchen or a heating apparatus that would serve a street. We like our own fires and our own bad cookery. It is as childish as if we wanted our own footpath and our own moon, and no doubt we would insist on these if we could. We pretend that romance would leave the world if the sausages were turned by a citizen in a municipal cap of liberty instead of by a wage slave, and that freedom would be dead if we warmed our toes at a civic fire. I wonder that no one takes exception to the communal warmth of the sun. The present wastefulness would be little worse than an insane joke if all this multiplying of cooks and parlour-maids did not absorb such an amount of reluctant youth and deftness and energy. But, alas, our ideals of private citizenship seldom mean that we do our work privately ourselves. They only mean that we privately hire somebody else to do it. In other words, they are usually a violation of the private citizenship of somebody else. Consequently, though we enjoy helping in the wastefulness of it all as a puppy enjoys tearing a book, we do not feel justified in elevating our tastes into an ethical system. We are simply grabbers of the corn supply. Probably even in 100 years, people will look back on our present West European society and marvel at the common habit of prosperous men in sitting down to a table where there are far more dishes and elegancies than they could ever absorb, while men, women, and children walk the streets empty. I seldom sit down to dinner in a hotel without a sense that I am being offered three people's food. No, a society that gives three people's food to one man, and one man's portion of food or less to three people, must be the laughing stock of angels. The social waste that results from railway monopolies and battleship programs and the warren of small shops in every city is as nothing to this, except perhaps in so far as it is the cause of this. On the whole, however, the problem of waste goes deeper than battleships, which are but toys, and which will disappear as soon as the nations grow up and cease making faces at each other. It is a problem on the same level with lust, which, indeed, is a form of waste. It is one of the great problems of egoism, which is more concerned with mastery than with truth or common sense or gentleness. Not mastery of oneself, just gimcrack, made in Birmingham mastery. This is the mammon of our conceit upon whose altars we are willing to offer up the sacrifice of the wasted earth. End of section 10.
Chapter 11 of the Book of This and That, on Christmas. There is a cant of Christmas, and there is a cant of anti-Christmas. There are some people who want to throw their arms round you simply because it is Christmas. There are other people who want to strangle you simply because it is Christmas. Thus, between those who appreciate and those who depreciate Christmas, it is difficult for an ordinary man to escape bruises. As I grow older, I confess I accept Christmas more philosophically than I used to do. There was a time when it seemed a dangerous institution, like home life or going to church. One felt that in undermining its joys, one was making a breach in the defences of an ancient hypocrisy. Still more, one resented the steady boredom of the day, the boredom of a day from which one had been led to expect larger ecstasies than a surfeit of dishes and the explosion of crackers can give. One might have enjoyed it well enough, perhaps, if one had not had the feeling that it was one's duty to be happy. But to be deliberately happy for a whole day was a task as exhausting as deliberately hopping with one's feet tied. It was not that one wanted to be unhappy. It was merely that one desired one's liberty to be either as happy or as miserable as one pleased. Remembering these early hostilities, I would not bid anyone be happy or merry or jolly on Christmas Day, except as the turkey and plum pudding move them. At the same time, I cannot let the festival pass without recanting my childish insolence towards the holly and the mistletoe. I have been converted to Christmas as thoroughly almost as that prince of individuals, Scrooge. I can now pull a cracker with any man. I can accept gifts without actual discourtesy. And if the flame goes out before the plum pudding reaches me, I am as mortified as can be. The Christmas tree shines with the host of the stars, and I can even forgive my neighbor who plays "While Shepherds Watched" all day long on the gramophone. The Salvation Army, which plays the same tune and one or two others all through the small hours on the trombone and the cornet à piston, is a severer test of endurance. But even that one can grin and bear when one remembers that the Salvationist bandsmen are but a sort of melancholy herald angels. The solitary figure in the Christmas procession, indeed, whom one hates with a boiling and bubbling hatred, is the postman who does not call. In Utopia the postman does not miss a letter box on Christmas Day, or any other day. It would be affectation to pretend, however, that one has suddenly developed a craving for plum pudding and cracker mottoes in one's middle age. One's reconcilement with Christmas is due neither to one's stomach nor to a taste for the wit and wisdom of cracker manufacturers. It is simply that one has come to enjoy a season of lordly inutility, when for the space of a day or two the cash nexus hangs upon the world as light as air. It is no small thing to have this upsetting of the tyrannies, if it is only for a few hours. The heathen, as we call them, realized this even before the birth of Christ, and had the Saturnalia and other festivals of the kind in which a communism of license ruled, if not a communism of gentleness. It is still an instinct in many Christian places to turn Christmas into a general orgy, to make it a day on which one bows down and worships the human maw, and there are worse things in the world than brandy sauce. On the other hand, there is also the instinct to make of the day a door into a new world of neighborliness. It is the only day in the year on which many men speak humanly to their servants and open their eyes to the cheerful lives of children and simple people. Hypercritical youth will deny that man has a right to confine his neighborliness to a single day in the year any more than he has a right to confine his sanctity to the Sabbath. But we who have ceased to exact miracles from human nature are glad to have even a single day as a beginning. Socialism, we may admit, depends upon the extension of the Christmas festival into the rest of the year. It demands that the relations between man and man shall be, as far as possible, not shopkeeping relations, but Christmas relations. In other words, it aims at a society in which the little conquests of gain will cease to be the chief end of time, and men will no more think of cheating each other than Romeo would think of cheating Juliet. Nor is there any other side of the new civilization which will be more difficult to build than this. This is the very spirit of the new city. Without it, the rest would be but a chaos of stones and mortar, a Gehenna of purposeless machinery. It is an extraordinary fact that the rediscovery of Christmas in the 19th century was not followed sooner by the rediscovery of the limitations of individualism. Dickens himself, the incarnation of Christmas, did not realize till quite late in life what a denial modern civilization is of the Christmas spirit. Even in hard times, where, as Mr. Shaw pointed out, he expresses the insurrection of the human conscience against a Manchesterized society, he offers us no hope except from the spread of a sort of Tory benevolence. Perhaps, however, it does not matter how you label benevolence so long as it is the real thing, and is not merely another name for that most insidious form of egotism, patronage. That Dickens was pugnaciously benevolent in all his work, except when he was writing about dissenters and Americans, was one of the most fortunate accidents in the popular literature of the 19th century. He did not perhaps dramatize the secret mystery of human brotherhood, the brotherhood of saint and fool and criminal and ordinary man, as Tolstoy and Dostoevsky had done in some of their work, but he dramatized goodwill with a thoroughness never attempted before in England. On the whole, it may be doubted whether the Christmas spirit has not grown stronger and deeper since the time of Dickens. Only a few years ago it seemed as though it were dying. People began to detest even Christmas cards as something more Victorian than the Idylls of the King. But here the old enthusiasm is back again, and we can no more kill Christmas than the lion could kill Androcles. Perhaps the popularization of Italian art, as well as Dickens, has something to do with it. Our imaginations cannot escape from the Virgin and the Child, and we are like children ourselves in the inquisitiveness with which we peer into that magic stable, where the ass and the cow worship, and the shepherds and the kings and the little angels in their nightgowns are on their knees. There has come back a gaiety, a playfulness into the picture, such as our grandfathers might have thought irreverent, but their grandfathers' grandfathers, on the other hand, would have seen to be perfectly natural. The cult of the child has, perhaps, been overdone in recent years, and we have brought our mawkishness and our morbid analysis even to the side of the cradle. At the same time, no one has yet been able to point out a way by which we can escape from the obsession of rates and taxes, of profit and loss, except by the recovery of a child's vision. Without that vision, religion itself becomes a matter of profit and loss. With that vision, the dullest world blossoms with flowers. Even truisms cease to be meaningless. And Christmas is itself again. Out of the drowning of the world we have made a toy for the nursery, and the birth of the King of Glory has become the theme of a song for infants. One of the most exquisite pictures in literature is that of the three ships that come sailing into Bethlehem on Christmas Day in the morning. And not less childishly beautiful is that other carol. There comes a ship far sailing then, St. Michael was the steersman, St. John sat in the horn, our Lord harped, Our Lady sang, and all the bells of heaven they rang on Christ's Sunday at morn. One sees the same childish imagination at work in the old English carol, Hail, comely and clean, in which the three shepherds come to the inn and stable with their gifts, the first with a bob of cherries for the new-born baby, the second with a bird, and the third with a tennis ball. Hail, cries the third shepherd, hail, darling dear, full of God heed, I pray thee be near, when that I have need. Hail, sweet thy cheer, my heart would bleed to see thee sit here in so poor weed, with no pennies. Hail, put forth thy doll, I bring thee but a ball, have and play thee withal, and go to the tennis. These songs, it may be, are more popular today than they were 50 years ago, partly owing to the decline of the old-fashioned, suspicious sort of Protestantism which saw the Pope behind every bush, including the holly bush. One remembers how Protestants of the old school used to denounce even Raphael's grave Madonnas as trash of popery. "I'll have no popish pictures in my house," declared a man I know to his son who had brought home the Sistine Madonna to hang on his walls, and the picture had to be given away to a friend. Similarly, the observance of Christmas Day was regarded in some places as a popish superstition. One old Protestant clergyman many years ago used to make the rounds of his friends and parishioners on Christmas morning to wish them the compliments of the day. It was his custom, however, to pray with each of them, and in the course of his prayers to explain that he must not be regarded as taking Christmas Day seriously. "Lord," he would pray, "we are not gathered here in any superstitious spirit, as the Roman Catholics are, under the delusion that thy Son was born in Bethlehem on the 25th of December. Hast not thou told us in thy holy book that on the night on which thy Son was born, the shepherd watched their flocks by night in the open air? And thou knowest, O Lord, that in the fierce and inclement weather of December, with its biting frosts and its whirling snows, this would not have been possible, and can be but a popish invention." But having set himself right with God, he was human enough to proceed on his journey of good wishes. Noble intolerance like his is now, I believe, dead. Today even a Plymouth Brother may wreathe his bow with mistletoe, and a Presbyterian may wish you a Merry Christmas without the sky or the Shorter Catechism falling. End of section 11.
The Book of This and That by Robert Lynd. Chapter 12. On Demagogues. It is still the custom in civilized countries for the politicians to call each other names. The word serpent has, one regrets to say, fallen out of use. But we are compensated for this in some measure by the invention of new terms of insult almost every day. It is not very long since Mr. Lloyd George called Mr. Steele Maitland the cat's meat man of the Tory party, and Mr. Steele Maitland retorted by calling Mr. Lloyd George Gehazi the leper. And side by side with original fancies of this kind, the old-fashioned dictionary of abuse still stands as open as the English Bible, where statesmen may arm themselves with nouns and adjectives that everybody can understand, such as duke, turncoat, jackcade, paid agitator, Irish, attorney, despot, nefarious, which was almost as dead as serpent till Sir Edward Carson revived it, And last but not least, demagogue. It is only a day or two since Mr. Bonner Law called Mr. Lloyd George a demagogue, and one was disappointed to find that Mr. Lloyd George, instead of calling Mr. Bonner Law Nebuchadnezzar or Judas Iscariot in return, merely insisted that he could not be a demagogue because a demagogue was a man who kicked away the ladder by which he had risen. This is very much as if you were to call a man Bill Sikes, and he retorted that he could not be Bill Sikes because Bill Sikes had a wooden leg. Of course, Bill Sikes had not a wooden leg, and a demagogue is not necessarily a man who kicks away the ladder by which he has risen. A demagogue is simply a mob leader, a man who appeals to popular passions rather than principles. He is what half the statesmen of all parties aspire to be in every democratic community. Despots obtain their mastery over the crowd by the sword, demagogues by the catchword. That is the difference between a tyranny and a democracy. It may not seem to be a change for the better to those who have a taste for the costumes and lights of the theatre, but the demagogue at least consults the mob as though it had a mind and will of its own. The very way in which he flatters it and instigates it to passion is an assertion of its freedom of choice, and therefore a concession to the dignity of human nature. It is like wooing, as compared with marriage by capture. Even when we have put the demagogue securely above the despot, however, we are left in considerable doubt about him. Somehow or other, we do not like him. We do not trust him further than we can see him. We distrust him, as Aristophanes, Shakespeare, and Dickens did. We feel that the difference between a demagogue and a statesman is that the former converts human beings into a mob, while the latter exalts a mob into a company of human beings. It is the difference between a pander and a prophet. It is true that men of a conservative temper hate the pander and the prophet almost equally. Shakespeare, for instance, who is a bad politician as well as a good poet, mocks at utopias no less than at bombast in that unhistorical picture he suggests of Jack Cade. Cade. There shall be in England 7 halfpenny loaves sold for a penny. The 3-hooped pot shall have 10 hoops, and I will make it felony to drink small beer. All the realm shall be in common, and in Cheapside shall my palfrey go to grass. And when I am king, as king I will be. All. God save your majesty. Cade. I thank you, good people. There shall be no money. All shall eat and drink on my score, and I will apparel them all in one livery, that they may agree like brothers, and worship me their lord. Dick. The first thing we do, let's kill all the lawyers. Cade. Nay, that I mean to do. To many of us, if you omit Cade's occasional lapses into individualism, as in his desire to be worshipped as a king, this will seem an admirable program. It will more than hold its own in comparison with any program that ever originated in Newcastle or Birmingham. William Morris himself might have had that vision of restoring Cheapside to green fields, and even the extremist Marconoclast could hardly go further than Cade in suggestions for a summary way with lawyers. Who is there who is not wholeheartedly with Cade for the abolition of poverty? In fact, there seems little to criticize in the man as Shakespeare drew him, except that he makes proposals for personal, not social ends. That, I believe, is the real essence of demagogy. To be a demagogue is not to advocate one thing rather than another. It depends on the manner, not on the matter, of one's proposals. One may reap one's own glory out of praise of the New Jerusalem no less than out of the most vulgar incitements to war and hatred. It is a temptation to which every man is subject who has ever stood on a cart above a crowd of his fellows. One feels tempted to play on them, like a child who finds itself left alone with a piano. It is worse than that. A crowd is like a sea of liquor, the fumes of which go to an orator's head and make him boast and lie and leer as he would be ashamed to see himself doing in his sober senses. He becomes, to parody Novalis on Spinoza, a mob-intoxicated man. But there is one notable difference between a decent drunkard and a demagogue. The drunkard is satisfied with getting drunk himself. The demagogue is not content till he has made the crowd drunk too. He and the mob are, as it were, mutual intoxicants. And in the result, many a public meeting turns into so disgraceful an orgy that, if anything comparable to it occurred in a music hall, the license would be withdrawn. This is a kind of vice of which the moralists have not yet taken sufficient note. And yet there is no more execrable passion on earth than demagogue passion on the one hand and mob passion on the other. Cleon will always be remembered as one of the basest Athenians who ever lived, and this is because he was the first demagogue of imperialism, a violent animal on his hind legs who bellowed till he woke up the blood lust of his fellow citizens. He was powerful only so long as he could keep that and other popular lusts active. Men, it has been said by a notable philosopher, seek after power rather than beauty. But this, I believe, is only true of demagogues and egoists of kindred sorts. The demagogue is the man who, instead of aiming at bringing the mob to his mood, feels after the mood of the mob, and having discovered it, whips it into froth and fury. If you keep your eyes open at a public meeting, not always an easy thing to do in days when men discuss Welsh disestablishment, you will see how the demagogue often becomes the master of a meeting that has listened coldly to intelligent and honest speeches. Like pot-boiling in art, it is perfectly easy if you know the way. The sausage seller, who aspired to be Cleon's rival in the Knights of Aristophanes, expounds the whole art of demagoguery in his prayer. Ye influential, impudential powers of sauciness and jabber, slang and jaw, ye spirits of the marketplace and street, where I was reared and bred, befriend me now, grant me a voluble utterance, and a vast unbounded voice, and steadfast impudence. And in another passage, Demosthenes initiates him into the means of obtaining power over the people. Interlard your rhetoric with lumps of mawkish, sweet, and greasy flattery. Be fulsome, coarse, and bloody. This, indeed, is what oratory is bound to degenerate into in a democracy, unless it is the weapon of a conviction. It is like any other form of art which is practiced not from any burning and generous motive, but from mere love of that sense of power which gain and popularity give. Dickens, owing to a curious gap in his knowledge, made his typical trade union leader, Slackbridge, in Hard Times, a demagogue of the ranting type, who began a speech, "Oh, my friends, the downtrodden operatives of Coketown! Oh, my friends and fellow countrymen, the slaves of an iron-handed and grinding despotism! Oh, my friends and fellow sufferers, the fellow workmen and fellow men!" Slackbridge, we are also told, was an ill-made, high-shouldered man with lowering brows, and his features crushed into an habitually sour expression. That represents the attitude of many people to popular leaders. They believe that no one can advocate a reasonable future for the poor without being venomous and of an ugly appearance. They do not realize that the demagogues and agitators of today are chiefly men of the propertied classes and their allies, like Sir Edward Carson and Mr. F. E. Smith. Sir Edward Carson's speeches in Ulster, indeed, are the most extreme instances of demagogy we have had in recent years. They are all noise and passion, roaring echoes of the mob's soul, rhetoric and not reason, thunderstorms instead of light. They are appeals to the war spirit, the same spirit that Cleon and all the demagogues have sought to awaken. Incidentally, I admit that a class war or a sex war may as readily produce its Carsons as a war of sectarianism. Sir Edward Carson is the awful example to all creeds and classes of how not to do it. End of chapter 12.